In the shadow of a small Missouri chapel, a billionaire who lost everything in one tragic night encounters a barefoot child who whispers 4 impossible words that will shatter his carefully constructed world. I can heal your eyes. Richard Collins built a tech empire worth $2 billion before a devastating accident claimed both his sight and his beloved wife, leaving him vulnerable and desperate for hope. But when a mysterious little girl approaches him with a promise that defies every medical expert's diagnosis, he faces an unthinkable choice between trusting science or believing in miracles. What Richard doesn't know is that the woman sleeping beside him every night, the beautiful fiancée who pledges her unwavering devotion, is orchestrating the most elaborate betrayal of his life. As his vision begins to return through the child's inexplicable healing methods, Richard starts seeing things he was never meant to discover. Secret phone calls, forged documents, and a conspiracy so devastating it could destroy everything he has left. The little girl's gift isn't just restoring his sight, it's opening his eyes to a truth so shocking it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and the people closest to us. This is a story about more than healing. It's about the terrifying realization that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those who claim to love us most. Every revelation will leave you breathless. Every twist will shatter your expectations, and the final truth will haunt you long after the story ends. Don't forget to follow our channel for more incredible stories that will touch your heart and blow your mind. Hit that like button if this story moved you, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. The autumn wind swept through the small town of Cedar Falls, Missouri, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the distant echo of Sunday church bells. The modest white chapel on Elm Street had just released its congregation into the crisp October afternoon, and the usual crowd of parishioners lingered on the steps, their voices a gentle murmur of community gossip and weekend plans. But today was different. Today Richard Collins was among them. The billionaire tech mogul moved slowly down the chapel's worn stone steps, his polished Italian leather shoes finding each step with the careful precision of a man who had learned to navigate a world he could no longer see. His custom-made titanium walking cane tapped rhythmically against the ground, tap, step, creating a sound that seemed to silence the casual chatter around him. At 38, Richard Collins was a man who had once commanded boardrooms with a single glance, who had built an empire worth over $2 billion before his 30th birthday. Now 18 months after the tragic car accident that had claimed both his sight and his beloved wife Sarah, he moved through the world like a ghost of his former self. "Careful, darling," Claire whispered, her manicured fingers gripping his left arm with what appeared to be loving concern. Her voice carried the practiced sweetness of someone who had perfected the art of public affection. "The last step is a bit higher than the others." Claire Morrison was everything that high society magazines celebrated. Blonde, beautiful, and bred from old Connecticut money. At 29, she possessed the kind of effortless elegance that turned heads at charity galas and made other women unconsciously touch their own hair in comparison. She had entered Richard's life 6 months ago through mutual friends, appearing like an angel of mercy when he needed guidance the most. Her devotion seemed unwavering, her patience endless, and her love genuine enough to convince even Richard's most skeptical business associates. The small crowd of churchgoers watched with a mixture of admiration and pity as the unlikely couple made their way toward the black Bentley waiting at the curb. Martha Henderson, the 70-year-old church organist, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Such a tragedy," she whispered to her neighbor. "But isn't it beautiful how love finds a way? That girl is a saint for standing by him." Richard felt the weight of their stares, heard the hushed tones of their sympathy, and fought the familiar surge of anger that threatened to surface. He had never wanted pity, had never asked for it, and yet it followed him everywhere like an unwelcome shadow. The accident had taken more than his sight. It had stripped away his independence, his confidence, and his ability to trust his own judgment about the people around him. "Just a few more steps to the car," Claire murmured, her voice barely audible above the gentle rustling of leaves. "Then we can go home and you can rest." But as they approached the sidewalk, something unexpected happened. A small figure emerged from behind the large oak tree that stood sentinel beside the chapel entrance. She was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with tangled brown hair that caught the afternoon sunlight and revealed auburn highlights that no salon could replicate. Her clothes, a faded red sweater that had seen too many winters and jeans with carefully patched knees, marked her as one of the town's forgotten children, the kind that teachers noticed but rarely mentioned in parent conferences. The little girl's feet were bare despite the October chill, and her dark eyes held an intensity that seemed far too mature for her small face. She stepped directly into Richard's path with the fearless determination that only children possess, causing Claire to pull up short with a sharp intake of breath. "Excuse me," Claire said, her voice taking on the crisp edge she typically reserved for servants and solicitors. "You need to move out of the way, sweetie. This gentleman can't see you standing there." But the child didn't move. Instead, she tilted her head and studied Richard with the unblinking focus of someone trying to solve a particularly difficult puzzle. The churchgoers began to notice the unusual scene, this small, disheveled girl blocking the path of one of America's wealthiest men and his elegant fiancée. Richard felt something shift in the air around him, a subtle change in the rhythm of breathing and movement that his heightened senses had learned to detect. His cane had touched something soft, the girl's bare foot, and he heard the slight catch in her breath that suggested she was gathering courage for something important. "Sir," the little girl said, her voice clear and sweet despite a slight tremor of nervousness. "I know you can't see me, but I need to tell you something." Claire's grip on Richard's arm tightened noticeably. "Honey, we really need to—" But the child pressed on, stepping even closer, until Richard could smell the scent of autumn leaves in her hair and detect the faint aroma of wood smoke that clung to her clothes. When she spoke again, her words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would change everything. "I can heal your eyes." The world seemed to freeze in that moment. The gentle murmur of the departing congregation fell silent. Even the wind appeared to hold its breath, leaving only the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere down the street. Richard felt his heart skip a beat, then begin to pound with a force that made him grateful his blindness concealed the shock that must have been written across his face. Claire's response was immediate and dismissive. A laugh escaped her lips, bright, tinkling, and thoroughly artificial. "Oh, how precious," she said loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Children have such wonderful imaginations, don't they?" But Richard barely heard her. Something about the little girl's voice, about the absolute certainty with which she had spoken those impossible words, had struck him like lightning. He had consulted with the world's finest ophthalmologists, had undergone every experimental treatment available, had spent millions of dollars chasing even the faintest hope of recovery. Every single medical expert had delivered the same verdict. The damage to his optic nerves was irreversible, complete, permanent. Yet here stood this barefoot child, this nobody from nowhere, claiming she could accomplish what the greatest minds in medicine had declared impossible. That's very kind of you to say," Richard managed, his voice hoarse with emotions he couldn't name. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his grip on the walking cane. "But I'm afraid my condition is quite serious." The little girl stepped closer still, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her small body despite the cool afternoon air. "I know it is," she said softly, her voice carrying a wisdom that seemed to contradict her obvious youth. "The doctors told you there was no hope, didn't they? They said the nerves were too damaged, that nothing could fix what was broken." Richard's breath caught in his throat. How could this child possibly know the specific details of his medical diagnosis? He had been extremely private about his condition, sharing the devastating prognosis only with Claire and his closest advisors. "Come along, Richard," Claire said firmly, her previous sweetness replaced by barely concealed irritation. "We're causing a scene, and this child obviously needs to get home to her parents." But the little girl wasn't finished. She reached out and, with a boldness that shocked everyone present, placed her small hand on Richard's free arm. Her touch was gentle but electric, sending an unexpected warmth through his entire body. "My name is Emily," she said, looking up at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "And I meant what I said. I can help you see again, but only if you're brave enough to believe in something the grown-ups say is impossible." Ooh, the crowd of onlookers had grown larger, drawn by the unusual spectacle of this odd encounter. Some watched with amused expressions, clearly viewing it as nothing more than a child's flight of fancy. Others seemed genuinely moved by the girl's earnest demeanor and the obvious effect her words were having on the blind billionaire. Margaret Foster, who ran the town's small diner, whispered to her husband, "Look at his face, Jim. That little girl has him shook up something fierce." Indeed, Richard's carefully composed mask had slipped entirely. His lips were slightly parted, his breathing shallow and rapid. For the first time since the accident, someone had offered him hope. Not the carefully worded possibilities that doctors occasionally mention to avoid lawsuits, but pure, unqualified hope delivered with the conviction of absolute truth. Claire's patience finally snapped. "That's quite enough," she said sharply, positioning herself between Richard and the child. "You need to run along home now, little girl. Mr. Collins has been through a great deal, and it's cruel to fill his head with impossible promises." But Emily didn't retreat. Instead, she looked directly at Claire with an expression that seemed far too knowing for a child her age. "Sometimes the impossible is just something we haven't figured out how to see yet," she said quietly. Then, turning back to Richard, she added, "I'll be here tomorrow at the same time, sitting on the bench by the old elm tree. If you want to know more, you can find me there." With that, she turned and walked away, her bare feet making no sound on the sidewalk as she disappeared around the corner of the chapel. The crowd began to disperse, their voices now animated with speculation and gossip about what they had just witnessed. Richard stood frozen in place, his mind reeling. Every rational thought told him the encounter had been meaningless, the desperate promise of a lonely child seeking attention, or perhaps hoping for a reward. But something deeper, something that had nothing to do with logic or medical science, whispered that Emily's words contained a truth he desperately needed to hear. "Richard." Claire's voice seemed to come from very far away, though she was standing right beside him. "Are you all right? You look pale." He turned toward her voice, acutely aware that his heightened senses were picking up something new in her tone. A tension that hadn't been there before, an undercurrent of something that might have been fear. But fear of what? What could possibly threaten her about a child's innocent, if impossible, promise? "I'm fine," he said automatically, though they both knew it wasn't true. Just surprised, I suppose. As they settled into the Bentley for the drive back to his estate, Richard found himself unable to shake the memory of Emily's voice, the absolute certainty with which she had spoken, and the strange warmth that had flowed through him at her touch. More troubling still was the growing awareness that Claire's dismissal of the child had seemed less like protective concern and more like calculated damage control. For the first time in 18 months, Richard Collins felt something he had thought was lost forever, curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice wondered if perhaps there were more than just his eyes that needed healing. The black Bentley pulled away from the curb, carrying its passengers toward an uncertain future, while behind them, the empty bench beside the old elm tree stood waiting for tomorrow's impossible possibilities. The sprawling Collins estate sat like a monument to success on 43 acres of manicured Connecticut countryside, its Georgian colonial architecture, speaking of old money and established power. As the Bentley wound up the circular driveway, past towering oak trees that had witnessed 3 generations of Collins' family triumphs and tragedies, Richard felt the familiar weight of isolation settling over him like a heavy blanket. The mansion's 27 rooms had once echoed with Sarah's laughter, with the sounds of dinner parties and business meetings that shaped the tech industry. Now it felt more like a beautifully appointed mausoleum. Claire's heels clicked against the marble foyer as she guided Richard through the entrance hall, past the crystal chandelier that had cost more than most people's houses, and beneath the oil paintings of his ancestors who stared down with stern disapproval. The silence between them had stretched uncomfortably during the entire 40-minute drive from Cedar Falls, punctuated only by Claire's occasional attempts at light conversation that died quickly in the face of Richard's distracted responses. "Mrs. Patterson has prepared your favorite dinner," Claire said, her voice echoing in the vast space as she helped him out of his cashmere overcoat. "Herb-crusted salmon with that risotto you love. I thought we could eat in the sunroom and discuss the Foundation's charity gala next month." But Richard barely heard her. His mind remained fixed on the extraordinary encounter outside the chapel, replaying every word, every inflection in Emily's voice. The child's absolute certainty haunted him, not because he believed her impossible claim, but because something in her manner had stirred a hope he thought he had successfully buried alongside his wife. "Richard." "Undie," Claire's voice carried a sharp edge now, the kind of tone one might use with a disobedient child. "You haven't heard a word I've said, have you?" He turned toward her voice, his unseeing eyes focusing somewhere over her left shoulder. "I'm sorry. I was thinking about what happened today." Claire's intake of breath was sharp enough to hear. She moved closer, and he caught the expensive scent of her Chanel perfume mixed with something else, something that reminded him of anxiety sweat, though Claire never perspired in public. "Darling," she said, her voice dropping to the honey-sweet tone she used when trying to manage him, "you can't seriously be dwelling on the nonsense that little street urchin was spouting. Children say all sorts of ridiculous things to get attention. She probably thought you might give her money." Richard's fingers tightened around his walking cane. There it was again, that dismissive certainty, that immediate need to discredit Emily's words. She didn't ask for money. Of course not. She's smarter than that. First, she plants this ridiculous seed about healing your eyes, then she'll show up tomorrow with some sob story about her sick grandmother or hungry siblings. It's a classic con, Richard. Surely someone with your business acumen can see that? The accusation stung, partly because it echoed his own rational mind's attempts to explain away the encounter. But there was something in Claire's urgency to convince him that felt wrong, like a wrong note in an otherwise perfect symphony. "Maybe," he said carefully, "but I keep thinking about how she knew the specifics of my diagnosis. I've never discussed those details publicly." Claire's silence stretched a beat too long. When she finally spoke, her voice had taken on a brittle quality. "Medical information isn't as private as people think, especially for someone as prominent as you. That child could have overheard adults talking, read something online, pieced together details from news articles about the accident." Richard nodded slowly, but something nagged at him. Emily hadn't recited medical jargon or repeated newspaper headlines. She had spoken with the kind of intimate knowledge that suggested she understood not just the technical aspects of his condition, but the emotional devastation that accompanied it. "I suppose you're right," he said, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. "Of course I'm right." Claire's relief was palpable, and she moved closer, her hand finding his arm with practiced familiarity. "Now let's forget about this silliness and focus on us. Dr. Hawthorne called today about the wedding plans. He thinks a spring ceremony would be perfect, maybe April in the rose garden when everything's in bloom." "Indeed." As Claire chattered about flower arrangements and guest lists, Richard found his attention drifting. The house felt different somehow, as if Emily's words had shifted something fundamental in his perception. He began to notice things he had previously dismissed, the way Claire's voice changed when she thought he wasn't paying attention, how her footsteps sometimes paused outside his study as if she were listening, the subtle sounds of papers being moved in his office when she thought he was napping. After dinner, Richard excused himself to his study, claiming fatigue. The room had been his sanctuary since the accident, filled with the familiar sense of leather-bound books and the faint trace of his father's pipe tobacco that still lingered in the oak paneling after all these years. He settled into his favorite armchair, the one Sarah had insisted was too worn to keep, but that he refused to replace. Alone in the darkness that was now his constant companion, Richard allowed himself to truly consider Emily's words for the first time. The medical establishment had been unanimous in their verdict. His optic nerves were destroyed beyond repair. But what if they were wrong? What if there were possibilities they hadn't considered, treatments they didn't know about? The sound of Claire's voice drifted from the hallway, and he realized she was on the phone. Her tone was different now, clipped, professional, with an undercurrent of urgency that he had never heard before. "Told you he's starting to ask questions," she was saying, her voice barely above a whisper. "That brat today really shook him up." "No, I handled it, but we need to move faster than planned. The papers are almost ready, but if he starts getting suspicious..." Richard's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He strained to hear more, but Claire had moved farther away, her voice fading to an indistinct murmur. When she returned to the study 15 minutes later, her demeanor had completely transformed back to the loving, concerned fiancée. "You look tired, darling," she said, her hand resting on his shoulder with what felt like calculated tenderness. "Why don't you let me help you upstairs? You've had such an emotional day." As she guided him to his bedroom, Richard's mind raced. The phone call could have been about anything: wedding preparations, foundation business, personal matters. But the timing, combined with her earlier desperation to discredit Emily's words, painted a picture that made his stomach clench with dread. Later, lying in the king-sized bed that felt vast and empty without Sarah's presence, Richard stared into the darkness that was his world and wrestled with thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him. Was he being paranoid? Had the stress of his condition and the upcoming wedding made him suspicious of the one person who had stood by him through the worst period of his life? But Emily's voice echoed in his memory with startling clarity. "I can heal your eyes." Not might be able to, not could try to, but can. The absolute certainty in those 4 words carried a weight that all of modern medicine's careful qualifications could not match. For the first time since the accident, Richard Collins made a decision based entirely on hope rather than logic. Tomorrow, he would return to Cedar Falls. He would find the little girl who claimed she could work miracles. And maybe, just maybe, he would discover that impossible things were simply possibilities waiting for someone brave enough to believe in them. In the darkness of his bedroom, Richard smiled. A real smile, the first one that had reached his heart in 18 months. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The grandfather clock in the Collins mansion chimed 11 times as Richard carefully descended the marble staircase, his walking cane tapping softly against each step. The house slept around him. Claire had retired to her guest bedroom an hour earlier, claiming she needed her beauty rest for tomorrow's charity committee meeting. The servants had long since retreated to their quarters, leaving Richard alone with his racing thoughts and the decision that had kept him awake most of the night. He had told no one of his plan to return to Cedar Falls. Not Claire, not his driver Marcus, not even Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper who had practically raised him after his mother's death. This journey was something he needed to make alone, driven by a combination of desperate hope and the growing suspicion that his fiancée's reaction to Emily's words had been far too calculated for mere protective concern. The keys to his modified BMW sat in the small dish by the kitchen entrance, a car he hadn't driven since the accident. but one that had been specially equipped with audio navigation and enhanced safety features for the visually impaired. His hands trembled slightly as he picked them up, the metal cold against his palm. Driving blind was dangerous, possibly reckless, but Richard had navigated boardrooms full of sharks for 2 decades. Surely he could manage the 40-minute drive to a small Missouri town. The October morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn chill that bit through expensive wool coats and made breath visible in small puffs of vapor. As Richard carefully backed out of his driveway, guided by the car's proximity sensors and his own enhanced hearing, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 18 months, the intoxicating rush of independence. Every cautious mile brought him closer to answers, closer to the little girl who had spoken 4 impossible words that had shattered his carefully constructed world of resignation. Cedar Falls looked different in the morning light, though Richard could only experience it through his heightened senses of sound and smell. The town was waking up. He could hear the distant hum of early commuters, the rhythmic thud of newspapers hitting front porches, and the cheerful ding of the bell above Murphy's diner as the first customers of the day sought their caffeine salvation. The air carried the scent of bacon and freshly baked bread, mixed with the earthy smell of fallen leaves and the faint trace of wood smoke from chimneys preparing for winter. He parked near the chapel and made his way slowly to the old elm tree, his cane sweeping in careful arcs as he navigated the uneven sidewalk. The bench Emily had mentioned sat beneath branches that rustled with the whispered secrets of autumn wind. As he settled onto the weathered wood, Richard wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life or taking the first real step toward reclaiming it. He didn't have to wait long. The soft padding of bare feet against concrete announced Emily's arrival before her voice did, and when she spoke, it was with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had never doubted he would come. "I knew you'd be here," she said, settling beside him on the bench with the unself-conscious ease of childhood. Adults usually take a day to think about impossible things before they decide whether to believe in them. Richard turned toward her voice, acutely aware of how small she seemed next to him, how the morning chill must be affecting her inadequately clothed body. "And what made you think I'd choose to believe?" Emily was quiet for a moment, and he could sense her studying him with those dark, knowing eyes that seemed to see far more than a child her age should. "Because you're tired of being afraid," she said finally. "And because deep down, you know that what the doctors told you isn't the whole truth." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. How could this barefoot waif possibly understand the complex emotions he had spent months trying to process? How could she know about the fear that woke him in cold sweats, the terror that he would never again see a sunrise or Claire's face or the pages of a book? "The doctors ran every test imaginable," he said carefully. "They all reached the same conclusion. Tests only show what machines can measure," Emily replied, pulling her thin sweater tighter around her small frame. "But healing isn't always about fixing what's broken. Sometimes it's about awakening what's sleeping." Richard felt his skepticism warring with something deeper, a hunger for hope that had been growing stronger since yesterday's encounter. "And you believe you can do that? Awaken something in my eyes." Emily's hand found his arm again, just as it had the day before, and that same warmth spread through him like electricity. "My grandmother taught me things before she died," she said, her voice taking on a reverent quality. "Old things. Natural things. She said that sometimes, when the body gets shocked real bad, it forgets how to work right. But if you know the right way to remind it." She trailed off, and Richard heard her moving beside him, the rustle of fabric suggesting she was reaching for something. A moment later, he caught a scent that was unlike anything he had ever encountered, earthy and sweet, with undertones of herbs he couldn't identify. "This is what my grandmother left me," Emily said, pressing something small and smooth into his palm. It felt like a stone, but warm to the touch, as if it held some internal source of heat. She said it came from a place where the earth remembers how to heal things that doctors say can't be healed. Richard closed his fingers around the object, surprised by how right it felt in his hand, as if it belonged there. "What am I supposed to do with it?" "Did it hold it every morning when you wake up and every night before you sleep?" Emily instructed with the seriousness of a professor delivering a crucial lecture. "And while you hold it, remember what it felt like to see. Not just with your eyes, but with your heart. Remember the most beautiful thing you ever saw and feel what that felt like inside you." The simplicity of her instructions should have seemed ridiculous to a man who had built his fortune on complex algorithms and cutting-edge technology. Instead, Richard found himself nodding, already mentally cataloguing the most beautiful moments of his visual memory. Sarah's face on their wedding day, the sunset from their honeymoon in Tuscany, the way morning light used to filter through the windows of his study. "How long?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotions he couldn't name. "Different for everyone," Emily said. "My grandmother said healing happens when it's ready, not when we want it to. But she also said that believing makes it happen faster." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the morning warming around them as the sun climbed higher in the October sky. Richard found himself listening to the rhythm of Emily's breathing, steady and peaceful beside him, and marveling at how this strange child had managed to give him something that months of medical consultations and well-meaning friends had failed to provide: genuine hope. "Emily," he said finally, "why are you helping me? You don't know me. I'm just a stranger who happened to walk out of a church." The little girl was quiet for so long that Richard wondered if she had left without him noticing. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, tinged with a sadness that seemed far too mature for her years. "Because sometimes helping somebody else is the only way to heal the hurt inside yourself," she said. "And because my grandmother told me that when you have a gift, you have to use it for people who need it most. She said the saddest people are the ones who've lost their light, not just in their eyes, but in their hearts." Richard felt tears prick at the corners of his unseeing eyes. This child, this impossible, beautiful child, understood something about his condition that no medical professional had even attempted to address. That losing his sight had been only the beginning of a much deeper loss. "I'll try," he promised, squeezing the warm stone in his palm. "I'll do exactly what you told me." "I know you will," Emily said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "And Mr. Collins, when your eyes start to remember how to see again, don't let anybody tell you it's impossible. Sometimes the most important healing happens when nobody's watching." With that cryptic warning, she was gone, her bare feet making no sound as she disappeared into the morning bustle of Cedar Falls. Richard sat alone on the bench, holding a mysterious stone and nursing a hope that felt both fragile and indestructible, wondering if he had just committed himself to a fool's errand or taken the first step toward a miracle. Richard's hands trembled as he inserted the key into the BMW's ignition. Emily's warm stone clutched so tightly in his left palm that his knuckles had turned white. The drive back to the estate felt like a journey between two different worlds: the hopeful realm of impossible possibilities he had just left behind, and the suffocating reality of his carefully controlled existence that awaited him at home. Every mile brought a growing awareness that he was crossing a line from which there might be no return, carrying a secret that could either save him or destroy what remained of his structured life. The Collins mansion loomed before him as he navigated the circular driveway, its Georgian columns and manicured gardens a testament to old money and established power. But now, for the first time since the accident, the grandeur felt less like security and more like a beautiful prison. As he parked and made his way toward the entrance, Richard was acutely aware of how the morning's expedition had changed something fundamental in his perception, not just of his condition, but of the world around him. Claire's voice reached him before he had fully entered the foyer, sharp with an anxiety that immediately put him on alert. She was speaking rapidly into her phone, her heels clicking against the marble as she paced near the grand staircase. I don't care what it costs, she was saying, her voice carrying that clipped professional tone he had overheard the night before. Find out everything about her, where she lives, who she talks to, what family she has. A child like that doesn't just appear out of nowhere with whatever nonsense she was spouting yesterday. Richard froze in the doorway, his walking cane suspended mid-tap as Claire's words hit him like ice water. She was having Emily investigated. The little girl who had offered him hope, who had pressed a mysterious stone into his palm with promises of healing, was now the target of what sounded like a very thorough and very expensive background check. Richard! Claire's voice changed instantly, becoming honey-sweet and artificially bright as she noticed his presence. Darling, where have you been? I woke up and you were gone, and Mrs. Patterson said your car was missing. I was worried sick. The concern in her voice sounded genuine enough, but Richard's enhanced hearing caught the underlying tension, the slight breathlessness that suggested she was struggling to shift gears from whatever conversation she had just ended. He closed the door behind him with deliberate calm, buying himself a moment to process what he had overheard. I needed some air, he said carefully, his fingers instinctively tightening around Emily's stone. I drove out to clear my head. You drove? The alarm in Claire's voice was unmistakable now. Richard, that's incredibly dangerous. What if something had happened? What if you'd been hurt? She moved toward him with quick, clicking steps, and he felt her hands on his arms, checking him over as if he were a child who had returned from an unsupervised adventure. The gesture, which might once have seemed caring, now felt possessive and controlling. I'm fine, he said, gently extricating himself from her grip. The car has safety features, and I stayed on roads I know well. But Claire wasn't satisfied. Where exactly did you go? Maybe I should call Dr. Morrison. This kind of impulsive behavior could be a sign that you're not processing your grief properly. Sometimes trauma manifests in... I went to Cedar Falls, Richard interrupted, watching her reaction through his other senses. The sharp intake of breath, the barely perceptible step backward, the sudden silence that stretched just a beat too long, all confirmed his growing suspicions. Cedar Falls. Claire's voice was carefully neutral now, but he could hear the effort it took to maintain that control. Whatever for, Richard had prepared for this moment during the drive home, weighing how much truth he could reveal without putting Emily in danger. I wanted to see the chapel again, to think about yesterday, about that ridiculous child. The dismissive tone was back, but sharper now, edged with something that might have been fear. Richard, you can't seriously be dwelling on her nonsense. She was obviously some street kid looking for attention or money. Was she? Richard moved past Claire toward his study, his cane tapping against the familiar obstacles of home. Then why are you having her investigated? The silence that followed was deafening. Richard heard Claire's sharp intake of breath, the rustle of expensive fabric as she turned to follow him, the slight stumble in her usually perfect gait. When she finally spoke, her voice had taken on a defensive edge. I'm not having anyone investigated. I was calling the church to see if they knew anything about her family situation. A child that young shouldn't be wandering around alone, approaching strangers. It's a safety concern. The lie was smooth and practiced, but Richard's business instincts, honed by decades of detecting deception in boardrooms and contract negotiations, recognized it immediately. Claire was lying, and she was doing it with the kind of polished skill that suggested this wasn't her first time concealing the truth from him. Of course, he said mildly, settling into his leather armchair and placing Emily's stone carefully in his jacket pocket. How thoughtful of you to be concerned about her welfare. Over the following days, Richard began to notice things that had previously escaped his attention. Claire's phone rang more frequently, and her conversations, always conducted just out of his direct hearing, carried an urgency that seemed disproportionate to wedding planning or foundation business. She asked more questions about his daily activities, his thoughts, his mood, with the kind of casual persistence that felt increasingly like surveillance. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Collins family for 30 years, began appearing at odd moments with helpful observations delivered in her gentle Irish accent. "That Miss Clare," she mentioned while organizing his desk, "she's been asking quite a lot of questions about your medical records, sir. Says she wants to make sure she understands your condition properly for the wedding planning." Another day, it was Marcus, his longtime driver, who expressed subtle concerns during their weekly review of the household vehicles. "Strange thing, Mr. Collins," Marcus said, his weathered hands polishing the Bentley's chrome with practiced efficiency. "Miss Clare asked me to install some kind of tracking system in all your cars. Says it's for security in case of emergencies. But the equipment she wants, well, it's more like what they use for surveillance than safety." Each piece of information was small, seemingly innocent, but together they painted a picture that made Richard's blood run cold. Claire wasn't just protective. She was building a cage around him, monitoring his movements, controlling his access to information, and systematically isolating him from anything or anyone who might threaten her influence over his life. But the most unsettling discovery came from Tommy, the young groundskeeper who maintained the estate's gardens. Tommy had Down syndrome, but possessed an uncanny ability to notice details that others missed, and his honest observations often revealed truths that more sophisticated minds overlooked. "Mr. Richard," Tommy said one afternoon as Richard sat in the garden, feeling the autumn sun on his face while secretly practicing Emily's healing ritual. "That Lady Clare, she goes into your office when you're sleeping. I see her from the window when I'm watering the plants. She looks at papers and takes pictures with her phone." The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. Claire was accessing his private documents, photographing his personal papers, potentially documenting everything from financial records to medical information. The woman he had trusted with his heart, his future, and his vulnerability was systematically betraying that trust in ways he was only beginning to understand. That night, as he lay in bed holding Emily's warm stone and visualizing the most beautiful memories of his sighted life, Richard felt something shift inside him, not just in his eyes, but in his understanding of the world around him. For just a moment, he could have sworn he saw a flicker of light, the faintest suggestion of shadows and shapes that shouldn't have been possible. But more importantly, he saw the truth about his situation with a clarity that had nothing to do with vision. Whatever Claire was planning, whatever web she was weaving around his life, Emily's impossible gift might be the only thing that could help him see clearly enough to escape it. The stone pulsed warm against his palm, and Richard smiled in the darkness, knowing that tomorrow would bring new revelations, and perhaps the beginning of a healing that encompassed far more than just his damaged eyes. The autumn rain drummed against the mansion's tall windows with increasing intensity as Richard sat in his study, Emily's stone warm in his palm, while he listened to the symphony of deception unfolding around him. It had been 5 days since his secret meeting with the little girl, 5 days of following her mysterious healing ritual, and 5 days of watching Claire's behavior grow increasingly erratic and suspicious. What troubled him most wasn't just what he was discovering about his fiancée. It was how much he had been blind to even before losing his sight. The sound of Claire's heels against the marble foyer had become as familiar as a metronome, marking time as she paced during her increasingly frequent phone calls. Today's conversation was particularly heated, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone under pressure. "No, you don't understand," Claire was saying, her words drifting through the partially open study door. "He's becoming suspicious. Yesterday he asked me directly about the investigation, and this morning I caught him listening at doors. We need to accelerate the timeline." Richard's fingers tightened around the stone as he strained to hear more. The investigation, she was admitting to it openly now, no longer bothering with the pretense of concern for Emily's welfare. But accelerate what timeline? And who was she talking to with such desperate urgency? "The papers are almost ready," Claire continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that forced Richard to hold his breath to catch her words. "Dr. Hawthorne says he can have the competency evaluation completed by Friday. Once that's filed with the court, it won't matter what he suspects or what that little brat told him." The words hit Richard like a sledgehammer to the chest. Competency evaluation. Legal papers. The pieces of Claire's puzzle were falling into place with terrifying clarity, revealing a picture so monstrous that part of him wanted to dismiss it as paranoid fantasy. She wasn't just planning to marry him, she was planning to have him declared mentally incompetent, seizing control of his fortune while he was helpless to stop her. The accident damaged more than just his eyes, Claire was saying now, her voice taking on the practiced sympathy she used in public. The trauma has clearly affected his judgment. These delusions about miracle cures, the reckless driving, the paranoid accusations, any court would see that he needs protection from himself. Richard's hand flew to his mouth to stifle the gasp that threatened to escape. Claire was planning to use his meeting with Emily, his desperate search for healing, as evidence of mental instability. Every hope she had dismissed, every question she had deflected, every concern she had minimized, it was all part of an elaborate manipulation designed to paint him as a man losing his grip on reality. The sound of approaching footsteps sent him scrambling to assume a position of casual relaxation, sliding Emily's stone into his jacket pocket just as Claire appeared in the doorway. Her perfume reached him first, that expensive Chanel scent, now tinged with the acrid smell of stress sweat she tried so hard to hide. "Darling," she said, her voice bright with artificial cheer, "I've brought you some tea. Earl Grey, just how you like it." Richard accepted the delicate china cup, noting how Claire's fingers lingered against his as she passed it to him. The gesture that once would have seemed affectionate now felt calculating, possessive. "Thank you. You're very thoughtful. I try to take care of you," Claire said, settling into the chair across from his desk with a soft rustle of expensive fabric. "Speaking of which, I've scheduled an appointment with Dr. Hawthorne for tomorrow afternoon. Just a routine checkup to make sure you're adjusting well to the engagement stress." Dr. Hawthorne, the same name she had mentioned during her phone call. Richard's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. "I wasn't aware I needed a checkup. I feel fine." "Of course you do, sweetheart." Claire's laugh was light and musical, but Richard's enhanced hearing caught the underlying tension. "But we want to make sure everything is perfect for the wedding. Doctor Hawthorne specializes in trauma recovery, and I thought it might be helpful to have a professional assessment of your emotional state." The trap was closing around him with surgical precision. Tomorrow's appointment wasn't a routine checkup. It was the competency evaluation Claire had mentioned to her mysterious phone companion. She was going to have him declared mentally unfit, and his own cooperation would be used as evidence of his diminished capacity. "That's very considerate," Richard said carefully, "but I'd prefer to postpone any medical appointments until after we've settled into married life. There's something to be said for not overthinking things." Claire's silence stretched a beat too long, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a new edge. "Richard, I really think you should see Dr. Hawthorne. Your behavior lately has been concerning. The impulsive driving, the fixation on that homeless child, the accusations about phone calls, these could be signs that you're not processing your grief as well as we thought." There it was, the careful construction of his supposed mental decline, delivered with the kind of loving concern that would sound perfectly reasonable to a court. Richard marveled at the skill with which she was manipulating the situation, using his own desperate search for healing as evidence of his instability. "I appreciate your concern," he said, rising from his chair with deliberate calm, "but I think I'm managing quite well. Perhaps we should discuss this later." As he moved toward the door, Richard felt Claire's eyes following him with laser intensity. Her breathing had changed, becoming shallow and rapid. The breathing of someone watching a carefully laid plan begin to unravel. "Richard, wait." Her voice carried a new note of urgency. "There's something else we need to discuss. I've been thinking about our security situation, and I believe we should consider having someone stay with you during the day, just until after the wedding, when I can be here more consistently. A bodyguard, or more accurately, a keeper, someone to watch his every move, monitor his activities, and ensure he couldn't interfere with whatever endgame Claire had planned." The beautiful cage she was building around him was almost complete. "That won't be necessary," Richard said firmly. "I value my independence, and I'm perfectly capable of managing on my own. But what if something happens? What if you have another episode like yesterday, driving off without telling anyone where you're going?" "I couldn't live with myself if—" "There was no episode," Richard interrupted, his voice carrying the authority he had once wielded in corporate boardrooms. "I went for a drive to clear my head. That's not a sign of mental instability. It's a sign of being human." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Richard could hear Claire's rapid breathing, the soft creak of her chair as she shifted position, the barely audible sound of her fingernails tapping against her phone case. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed completely. Gone was the honey-sweet concern, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Of course, darling. I'm just worried about you. But perhaps you're right. Maybe I have been overthinking things." The sudden capitulation should have been reassuring, but instead it sent chills down Richard's spine. Claire never gave up that easily, never backed down from a position she believed was important. This retreat felt strategic, like a chess player sacrificing a pawn to protect a more valuable piece. That evening, as Richard performed Emily's healing ritual in the privacy of his bedroom, he felt something unprecedented, a flash of light so brief and faint that he almost dismissed it as imagination. But as he held the warm stone and visualized Sarah's face on their wedding day, the darkness behind his eyelids seemed to shimmer with the ghost of vision. More importantly, he was beginning to see Claire's deception with perfect clarity. Tomorrow's appointment with Dr. Hawthorne wasn't just a trap. It was the final move in a game that had been playing out around him for months. But Richard Collins hadn't built a billion-dollar empire by allowing himself to be outmaneuvered by amateurs. As the storm outside intensified, he smiled in the darkness and began planning his own strategic moves. Emily's impossible gift was working in ways the little girl had never intended, opening his eyes to truths that had nothing to do with medical miracles and everything to do with the very real danger lurking in his own home. The healing had begun, but not in the way anyone expected. The storm that had been building all week finally unleashed its fury on the Collins estate as Thursday night descended like a black curtain over Connecticut. Rain lashed against the mansion's windows with violent intensity, while thunder rolled across the grounds like the angry voice of heaven itself. Richard sat in his study, Emily's stone pulsing warm in his palm as he listened to the symphony of nature's rage and tried to calm the matching tempest in his own heart. Tomorrow was his appointment with Dr. Hawthorne, the competency evaluation that Claire believed would be the final nail in the coffin of his independence. Tonight was his last opportunity to gather evidence of her betrayal, his final chance to understand the full scope of the conspiracy that had been unfolding around him while he stumbled through life in literal and figurative darkness. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, its deep bronze voice cutting through the storm's chaos. Claire had retired to her guest bedroom an hour earlier, claiming exhaustion from wedding preparations. But Richard's enhanced hearing had detected something unusual in her goodnight routine. The soft click of a lock being engaged, the muffled sound of furniture being moved, and most tellingly, the gentle ping of her phone, receiving multiple text messages in rapid succession. Something was happening tonight, something that required privacy and secrecy, even beyond Claire's usual careful deceptions. Richard rose from his leather armchair with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to navigate darkness through necessity rather than choice. Emily's healing rituals were working. Slowly, incrementally, but unmistakably. The flashes of light were becoming more frequent, lasting longer, revealing shapes and shadows that shouldn't have been possible according to every medical expert he had consulted. But more importantly, his other senses had sharpened to an almost supernatural degree, allowing him to perceive details and nuances that would have escaped him even when he had full vision. He moved through the mansion like a ghost, his bare feet silent against the Persian rugs and polished marble, his walking cane left behind in favor of stealth. The house felt different tonight, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Claire's betrayal was reaching its crescendo, and Richard could sense the weight of secrets pressing against the very walls of his ancestral home. The soft murmur of voices drew him toward the main living room, where warm light spilled beneath the heavy oak doors. Richard pressed his ear against the wood, his heart hammering as he recognized Claire's voice, but not the honey-sweet tone she used with him. This was the cold, business-like voice he had overheard during her mysterious phone calls, sharp with authority and devoid of the loving warmth she performed so convincingly in his presence. "Everything is in place for tomorrow," Claire was saying, her words clear despite the storm's interference. "Hawthorne will conduct the evaluation, find him mentally incompetent due to trauma-induced delusions, and file the necessary paperwork with the court. By Monday, I'll have legal guardianship and full control of his assets." Richard's blood turned to ice as a man's voice responded, deep, cultured, with the slight accent of someone educated at expensive East Coast schools. "And you're certain he suspects nothing?" This morning's phone call suggested he might be more aware than we anticipated. "Richard is blind in more ways than one," Claire replied with a laugh that chilled Richard to his bones. "He's so desperate for affection, so grateful that someone could love a damaged man, that he sees only what he wants to see. The poor fool actually believes I care about him." The casual cruelty in her voice was like a physical blow. Richard gripped the doorframe to steady himself, fighting waves of nausea as the woman he had planned to marry revealed the depth of her deception with devastating clarity. "What about the child?" the male voice asked. "Your investigation turned up some interesting information about her family background." "Emily Morrison," Claire said, and Richard could hear papers rustling as she consulted what sounded like a file. "Granddaughter of Helena Morrison, the local herbalist who died 6 months ago. The old woman had quite a reputation for folk healing. Completely unscientific nonsense, of course, but the townspeople swore by her remedies. The child has been living with distant relatives since Helena's death, but they're planning to send her to state care next month." Richard's heart clenched at the casual dismissal of Emily's situation, but worse was coming. Claire's voice took on a satisfied edge that made his skin crawl. "I've arranged for her removal to occur tomorrow morning, just before Richard's appointment. A concerned citizen reported a homeless child approaching wealthy strangers, possibly for criminal purposes. Child Services will take her into custody for her own protection, of course." The male voice chuckled with genuine amusement, eliminating his miracle cure and his sanity in one elegant stroke. "I have to admire your thoroughness, Claire." "I've been planning this for over a year," Claire replied with obvious pride. "Every gesture, every word, every moment of supposed devotion has been calculated to bring us to this point. Richard Collins is about to sign over a $2 billion fortune to the woman who destroyed his life, and he'll thank me for the privilege." "Bree!" Through the roaring in his ears, Richard heard footsteps approaching the door. His enhanced senses, sharpened by Emily's inexplicable healing process, detected the subtle change in air pressure that indicated movement. Someone was coming toward his hiding place, and discovery would mean the end of everything: his freedom, his fortune, and possibly his life. He melted backward into the shadows, his newly awakened vision catching glimpses of shapes and forms that guided him away from the living room just as the door opened. Claire's silhouette appeared in the doorway, backlit by the warm glow of the room beyond, and for one heart-stopping moment, Richard thought she had spotted him, but she was merely checking the hallway, ensuring their privacy remained intact. After a moment that felt like an eternity, she stepped back into the room and closed the door with a soft click. Richard stood frozen in the darkness of the grand staircase, his mind reeling from what he had discovered. Claire's betrayal was even more comprehensive than he had imagined. She had been planning his destruction for over a year, carefully manipulating every aspect of their relationship to position herself for this final devastating blow. The woman he had trusted with his broken heart was the architect of his ruin, and tomorrow she would complete her masterpiece of deception. But worse than his own situation was the immediate danger facing Emily. The little girl who had offered him hope, who had pressed a magical stone into his palm with promises of healing, was about to be swept away by the machinery of Claire's ambition. By tomorrow afternoon, Emily would be lost in the foster care system, and Richard would be declared mentally incompetent, 2 lives destroyed to feed one woman's greed. As Richard climbed the stairs to his bedroom, his mind raced with desperate plans and impossible options. Claire held all the cards, the legal papers, the complicit doctor, the carefully constructed narrative of his mental decline. But she had made one crucial mistake in her otherwise perfect scheme. She had underestimated the power of Emily's gift. As Richard performed the healing ritual that night, holding the warm stone while visualizing the most beautiful moments of his life, the flashes of light became something more. Sustained glimpses of his bedroom, clear enough to make out furniture and windows and the outline of his own hands. Emily's impossible cure was working faster than anyone could have predicted, and with his returning vision came a clarity that transcended the merely physical. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation between truth and deception, between love and manipulation, between the healing power of genuine hope and the destructive force of calculated betrayal. Richard Collins had built an empire by seeing opportunities that others missed, and now, thanks to a barefoot child's miraculous gift, he was about to see the most important opportunity of his life. The storm outside began to subside as dawn approached, but the real tempest was just beginning. The Friday morning sun filtered through the mansion's tall windows with deceptive warmth, casting long shadows across the marble foyer as Richard descended the grand staircase with measured steps. His vision, enhanced by Emily's miraculous healing process, now allowed him to perceive shapes, contrasts, and movement with startling clarity, enough to navigate without his walking cane, enough to see the elaborate trap that awaited him, and most importantly, enough to execute the desperate plan he had formulated during the sleepless hours before dawn. Claire stood in the breakfast nook, her designer dress perfectly pressed and her makeup flawlessly applied despite the early hour. She looked every inch the devoted fiancée, preparing to support her traumatized partner through a difficult medical appointment. But Richard's newly awakened sight revealed details that his other senses had missed. The tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed nervously against her coffee cup, and most tellingly, the thick manila envelope partially hidden beneath the morning newspaper. "Good morning, darling," Claire said, her voice bright with artificial cheer as she moved to kiss his cheek. "I've laid out your navy suit for the appointment with Dr. Hawthorne, the one that makes you look so distinguished and stable." The choice of words was carefully calculated, Richard realized. Even her compliments were designed to reinforce the narrative of his supposed mental fragility. Every interaction, every gesture, every moment of their relationship had been choreographed to support the devastating fiction she was about to present to the world. "Thank you," Richard replied, accepting the cup of coffee she pressed into his hands. "Though I have to say, I'm feeling much clearer this morning, almost like I'm seeing things with new eyes." Claire's laugh was musical and perfectly modulated, but Richard caught the slight hitch in her breathing, the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes, That's wonderful to hear. Dr. Hawthorne will be so pleased to know you're making progress. As they sat across from each other at the breakfast table that had witnessed 3 generations of Collins family meals, Richard studied the woman he had planned to marry with the cold, analytical mind that had built his empire. Claire Morrison was beautiful, intelligent, and utterly without conscience. A predator disguised as an angel of mercy, feeding on the vulnerability of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. "Claire," he said carefully, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Something flickered across her face, too quick for her to control, too revealing for her to hide. "Of course, Richard, you can ask me anything. Yesterday I overheard a phone conversation. Something about accelerating timelines and competency evaluations. I need to know, are you planning to have me declared mentally incompetent?" The silence that followed was deafening. Claire's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips, her carefully composed expression cracking like expensive porcelain. For a moment, Richard saw her as she truly was, not the loving fiancée she pretended to be, but the calculating adversary she had always been. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new edge, sharper, colder, stripped of its artificial warmth. "Richard, that's an incredible accusation. How could you even think such a thing? Because it's true, isn't it?" Richard leaned forward, his partially restored vision allowing him to see the fury building behind her blue eyes. "The appointment with Dr. Hawthorne isn't a routine checkup. It's a competency evaluation designed to prove I'm mentally unfit to manage my own affairs." Claire's mask slipped completely, revealing the predator beneath. She set down her coffee cup with enough force to rattle the delicate china, her movements sharp and aggressive. "And what if it is?" she snapped, her voice taking on the cold authority Richard had overheard during her secret phone calls. "Look at yourself, Richard. You're a broken man living in a fantasy world, chasing miracle cures from homeless children and driving around blind because you're too proud to accept reality. Maybe someone does need to protect you from yourself." And boom, the transformation was so complete, so shocking, that Richard felt his breath catch in his throat. This was the real Claire Morrison, ruthless, calculating, and utterly without remorse for the devastation she was about to inflict. "You've been planning this from the beginning," he said, the pieces of her elaborate deception finally forming a complete picture. "Everything. The romance, the engagement, the concern for my welfare. It was all a lie." Claire rose from her chair with predatory grace, moving around the table until she stood directly behind him. Her hand settled on his shoulders with possessive weight, her fingers digging into his muscles like talons. "Not a lie," she corrected, her voice now honey-sweet with mock sympathy. "A performance, and a brilliant one, if I do say so myself. For 18 months, I've played the perfect grieving widow's replacement, the patient angel willing to love a damaged man. Do you have any idea how exhausting it's been, pretending to care about your pathetic struggles with blindness and self-pity?" Each word was a knife thrust, designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. Richard felt the familiar surge of rage and humiliation that had plagued him since the accident. But beneath it was something new, a cold clarity that had nothing to do with his returning eyesight. "The accident," he said quietly. "You knew about Sarah's death before we ever met, didn't you? You targeted me specifically because you knew I'd be vulnerable." Claire's laughter was genuine now, bright with cruel amusement. "Sarah Collins, the perfect wife who died in that tragic car crash, leaving behind a grieving billionaire with trust issues and desperate need for female companionship. You were the perfect mark, Richard. Wealthy, isolated, and so grateful for affection that you never questioned my motives." She moved around the table to face him, her expression triumphant and utterly without mercy. "By this afternoon, you'll be declared mentally incompetent, and I'll have legal guardianship over your person and your assets. $2 billion, Richard. That's what your grief and loneliness are worth." The magnitude of her betrayal should have broken him. Instead, Richard felt something unexpected, a surge of strength that seemed to emanate from Emily's warm stone in his jacket pocket. The little girl's healing had awakened more than just his physical vision. It had restored his ability to see truth, to recognize deception, and to fight back against those who would exploit his vulnerability. "There's just one problem with your plan," Richard said, rising from his chair with newfound confidence. "I'm not the broken, helpless man you think I am anymore." Claire's smile faltered slightly. "What are you talking about?"
Emily Morrison," Richard said, watching as Claire's face went pale. "The little girl you've had investigated. The child you're having removed from town this morning to eliminate her influence on my supposed delusions."
"What you don't understand is that her gift is real, Claire, and it's working." For the first time since he had known her, Claire looked genuinely afraid. "That's impossible." "Your doctors said—" "My doctors were wrong," Richard interrupted, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded boardrooms and built an empire. "And so were you. You see, while you've been busy destroying my life, Emily has been healing it. Not just my eyes, but my ability to see the truth about the people around me." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the morning air, multiple vehicles moving fast toward the estate. Claire's head snapped toward the windows, her face a mask of confusion and growing panic. "What's happening?" she demanded. "What have you done?" Richard smiled, the first genuine smile he had felt in months. "I've done what I should have done the moment I realized what you were planning. I called the authorities, Claire. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division is very interested in your activities, especially the forged documents in my office safe and the interesting paper trail connecting you to several other wealthy widowers who died under suspicious circumstances." The color drained completely from Claire's face as the full scope of her exposure became clear. The sirens were getting closer, and with them came the end of her elaborate charade. "You can't prove anything," she said desperately, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I can," Richard replied, producing a small recording device from his jacket pocket. "Amazing what technology can do these days. Last night's conversation with your accomplice was particularly illuminating." As federal agents surrounded the mansion and Claire Morrison's carefully constructed world collapsed around her, Richard Collins stood in his ancestral home and truly saw clearly for the first time in 18 months, not just with his healing eyes, but with his restored soul. Emily's impossible gift had saved more than his vision. It had saved his life. 3 weeks later, the autumn sun painted Cedar Falls in shades of gold and amber as Richard Collins sat on the familiar bench beneath the old elm tree, his vision now restored to nearly perfect clarity thanks to Emily's miraculous healing. The little girl sat beside him, her bare feet swinging gently as she shared a chocolate ice cream cone he had bought from Murphy's Diner, the first of many small celebrations they would enjoy together in the days to come. The national media had dubbed it the Connecticut Conspiracy, and for 2 weeks, the Collins estate had been surrounded by news vans and reporters hungry for details about Claire Morrison's elaborate deception. The FBI investigation had uncovered a web of fraud that stretched back 5 years, involving at least 7 wealthy widowers who had fallen victim to Claire's calculated manipulations. 3 of those men had died under suspicious circumstances, their deaths ruled accidental despite insurance payouts that had enriched Claire and her network of accomplices by over $50 million. Dr. Hawthorne, the psychiatrist who had been prepared to declare Richard mentally incompetent, now faced federal charges for his role in the conspiracy. The forged documents found in Richard's safe revealed a sophisticated operation designed to systematically strip him of his legal rights and financial control. Claire's performance as the devoted fiancée had been so convincing that even Richard's closest business associates had been prepared to support her guardianship petition. "You saved my life," Richard said quietly, watching Emily lick chocolate from her fingers with the unself-conscious joy that only children possess. "If you hadn't given me your grandmother's stone, if you hadn't taught me to see with more than just my eyes." Emily looked up at him with those dark, knowing eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond her years. "My grandmama always said that healing isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about helping people remember who they really are underneath all the hurt." The profound simplicity of her words brought tears to Richard's eyes, tears he could now see clearly as they fell. For months after Sarah's death and his accident, he had defined himself by his losses, by his limitations, by his desperate need for someone to love him despite his damage. Claire had recognized that vulnerability and exploited it with surgical precision, but Emily had seen something else entirely. The man he had been before tragedy struck, the strength that lay dormant beneath his grief. "Your grandmother was a very wise woman," Richard said, pulling a thick envelope from his jacket pocket, "which is why I've done something I hope you'll understand." Emily tilted her head curiously as Richard opened the envelope, revealing legal documents that had been prepared by his attorneys over the past week. "I've established a foundation in your grandmother's name, the Helena Morrison Institute for Traditional Healing. It will fund research into folk medicine and natural healing methods, things that doctors like me have been too arrogant to take seriously." The little girl's eyes widened as Richard continued. "But more importantly, I've arranged for you to be adopted by people who will love you and appreciate your gifts. Marcus and his wife Helen have been wanting children for years, and they've agreed to take you in as their own daughter." Marcus, Richard's longtime driver, had been instrumental in gathering evidence against Claire. His wife Helen worked as a nurse at the local children's hospital, and both had been moved to tears when they learned about Emily's situation. The adoption papers had been expedited through the system with the kind of efficiency that substantial charitable donations could facilitate. Emily was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what Richard was telling her. When she finally spoke, her voice was small but filled with wonder. "You mean I'll have a real family? People who won't send me away?" "Never," Richard promised, his voice thick with emotion. "Marcus and Helen already love you, and they understand how special you are. They'll make sure you have everything you need, a home, an education, and the freedom to help people the way your grandmother taught you." Nuri, the tears that sparkled in Emily's eyes were tears of joy, and when she threw her small arms around Richard's neck in a fierce hug, he felt his heart healing in ways that had nothing to do with vision. This was what love really looked like. Not the calculating manipulation Claire had offered, but the pure, unselfish desire to protect and nurture someone who needed care. "There's something else," Richard said gently, producing a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a delicate gold locket, antique and beautiful, with intricate engravings that caught the afternoon light. "This belonged to my wife Sarah. She would have wanted you to have it, as a reminder that real love never asks for anything in return." Emily's hands trembled as she touched the locket, understanding instinctively the significance of the gift. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." As Richard fastened the chain around her neck, he thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The accident that had claimed his sight and his wife's life had seemed like the end of everything meaningful in his world. Claire's betrayal had threatened to destroy what little remained of his faith in human goodness. But Emily's impossible gift had restored more than his physical vision. It had opened his eyes to the profound truth that healing comes not from medical procedures or technological miracles, but from the connections we forge with others in our darkest hours. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both look up to see Marcus and Helen walking toward the bench, their faces bright with anticipation and love. Marcus carried a small suitcase, the beginning of Emily's new life, while Helen held a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from their garden. "Ready to come home, sweetheart?" Helen asked, her voice gentle and warm as she knelt beside Emily. Emily looked back at Richard one last time, her small hand reaching for his. "Will I still see you?" "Every week," Richard promised. "Uncle Richard isn't going anywhere." As the small family walked away together, Emily chattering excitedly between her new parents while they headed toward their modest but loving home. Richard remained on the bench beneath the elm tree, watching until they disappeared around the corner. The afternoon sun slanted through the golden leaves, painting everything in warm, healing light. His phone buzzed with a text message from his lead attorney. Claire Morrison sentenced to 25 years federal prison. Justice served. Richard deleted the message without responding. Claire's punishment was justice, but it wasn't healing. Healing had come from a barefoot child who had pressed a warm stone into his palm and reminded him that the most profound miracles often came disguised as impossible possibilities. As he stood to leave, Richard felt Emily's stone pulse gently in his pocket, no longer a tool for healing his eyes, but a reminder that the greatest vision comes from learning to see the world through the lens of love rather than fear, hope rather than despair, and faith rather than cynicism. Walking back to his car, Richard Collins smiled at the thought of Monday morning. For the first time in 18 months, he was looking forward to the future, seeing it clearly with eyes that had learned to distinguish between the shadows of deception and the brilliant light of truth. The healing was complete, but the real journey was just beginning. The end, Richard Collins' journey reminds us that sometimes our greatest tragedies become the gateway to our most profound healing. When life strips away everything we thought defined us, our abilities, our security, our trust, we discover that our true strength was never in what we could see, but in what we chose to believe. Emily's miraculous gift wasn't just about restoring physical vision. It was about awakening the courage to see truth, even when that truth shatters the illusions we've built around ourselves. How many of us, like Richard, have been blind to the very real dangers hiding behind beautiful facades? How many times have we ignored our instincts because we desperately wanted to believe in someone's love? This story challenges us to ask the difficult questions. Would you have had the strength to trust a barefoot child's impossible promise when medical science offered no hope? Could you have recognized the difference between someone who loves your brokenness and someone who exploits it? Sometimes the most profound healing requires us to see with our hearts rather than our eyes, to trust in possibilities that seem impossible, and to accept help from the most unexpected sources. Richard learned that true blindness isn't the inability to see, it's the refusal to recognize the difference between authentic love and calculated manipulation. As you reflect on this remarkable journey of betrayal, healing, and redemption, remember that in your darkest moments, hope often arrives wearing the most unlikely disguises. The next time life challenges your vision of reality, ask yourself, are you seeing with your eyes or are you seeing with your soul? If this story touched your heart and opened your eyes to new possibilities, please subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that miracles still happen and healing is always possible. Let us know in the comments what lesson touched you most deeply. Your insights might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear today.